with all this talk about the pelvic floor, let's take a moment to discuss some anatomy and where and what the pelvic floor is. Here's an image of my favorite set of bones, the pelvic basin. Now, you can see, if you take a look at this slide, that the pelvis is a bony ring or a circular structure. There's a big triangular bone in the back, the sacrum, and off the bottom of the sacrum comes the coccyx or the tailbone. The big wing bones that wrap around the sides of the pelvis are known as the ilium. The ilium then transitions down into the ischium in the back and the pubis in the front. And it's the pubis that forms that cartilaginous joint called the pubic symphysis. That pubic symphysis is such a common area for discomfort and pain during pregnancy. What about the pelvic floor itself? Well, now that we've talked about the bony structure a little bit, you can see at the bottom of this pelvis, that space at the bottom, it's entirely filled up by the pelvic floor. So on the left-hand side, this looks a little bit like a purple Mickey Mouse ears, and that whole space again is filled in by the pelvic floor. It's the bottom of what we call the core canister, and I'll speak to that a little bit more in just a moment, but it's basically the bottom of your bottom. Now, the anatomy of the pelvic floor is actually quite complex. It's made up of many muscles, along with all kinds of connective tissue and fascia, nerves, vessels, lots. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I just want you to know that the anatomy itself is quite complex. The pelvic floor is also what I call a dynamic trampoline. Sometimes we talk about the pelvic floor like a sling or a hammock that attaches to the sacrum on one end, sacrum and tailbone, and then runs all the way to the pubic bone in the front. But I don't want you to think saggy or droopy like a sling or a hammock. I want you to think more like a trampoline. It's strong, it's dynamic, it's elastic, okay? It plays a super, super important role in the body. As I mentioned before, the pelvic floor plays an important part of what we call the core canister, being the bottom of your bottom. So you can think of the core like a canister or a tube. You've got your diaphragm, gigantic respiratory muscle on the top. You've got your abdominal wall on the front and sides, and this, we're often most interested here in the deepest layer of abdominals or your transversus abdominis. And then in the back, you've got your deep spinal stabilizers like the multifidus muscles, and again, that pelvic floor on the bottom. So we really can't look at any of these structures in isolation. They really work together as a team. And so the pelvic floor is just as important as the diaphragm and the abs and the back muscles, but it is the bottom of the bottom. So I would say that it's most susceptible to gravity and some of those forces and impacts that come with exercise. Now that we've reviewed the anatomy, let's step aside from dysfunction and talk about healthy function. The pelvic floor actually plays 4 big roles as part of that foundational core. The first role is support. The pelvic floor has to support the structures above it. Primarily, these are the abdominal viscera, or your organs. So definitely the pelvic organs are kind of sitting right on top of it, but then you've got your stomach and your intestines and your liver and everything else a little bit higher. And they're all, in their own way, weighing down on the pelvic floor. This support role that the pelvic floor plays happens both when you're resting, but also during times of activity and exercise, or any time that there's that increase in intra-abdominal pressure. There are more demands on the pelvic floor at that time. And of course, during pregnancy. During pregnancy, even at rest, the loads and forces and demands are increased on the pelvic floor because there's just so much more volume in your core canister when you consider the size of the baby, the placenta, the amniotic fluid. So pelvic floor is working hard during pregnancy. The second role that the pelvic floor can play is a role of control, particularly for your sphincters, especially around the bladder and the bowel. So the pelvic floor plays a role in the elimination of waste, liquid and solid, and gas. The pelvic floor also plays an important role in sex. It plays a role in sensation, arousal, orgasm. It is deeply intertwined with all elements of that. And if we took it one step further, I would also say for birth, too. And the fourth role that the pelvic floor generally plays that's really important is a role of stabilization or stability. The pelvic floor again works with the rest of that core canister to help you stabilize your spine and give you that strong foundation for all movement.